I'll just very briefly introduce our panellists today. So speaking, we will have Hannah Vickers from ACE, James Wilcox from NACF, Kat Ibbotson from the Environment Agency, Chris Hayes from the SCS joint venture on HS2, Peter Yates from NACF and Constructing West Midlands, Charmaine Hughes, who is the chair of the Environment subgroup for NACF and from Manchester City Council, and then Fergus Harradence from Bays, and joining the panel with us later on will be Stuart Young, also from Bays. So welcome to all of our panellists and welcome to all of our attendees. So without further ado, I would like to hand over to Hannah for a few introductory remarks about the code and the Construct Zero initiative.
Brilliant, thank you, Jennifer, and it's a pleasure to be here, to be launching the code today, and I'm really looking forward actually to hearing how it's worked in practice. It's nice for someone as I am working across industry with lots of industry initiatives to actually have some projects and some businesses that have been rolling it out, so I'm really looking forward to that later on. So as you say, my role on the Construction Leadership Council is to jointly with Stuart to lead the Construct Zero programme. Now that is relatively new, and really what we are focusing on as the CLC through Construct Zero is the change that the industry needs to go through in order to meet net zero. So hopefully it's starting to become clear, the link with the code and why I'm here. But that's the sort of remit of Construct Zero, if you like. It's really sort of, as far as the CLC is concerned, about galvanising business action around net zero and being able to help businesses and clients and projects understand what it is they can do and focusing their efforts on the right things. So what we are looking for as part of this is to sort of curate and signpost interventions that businesses can take, such as the code, which is why I'm here, because it's actually things like this that are going to start to bring it to life and really start to help that learning and to help projects and businesses to take those decisions on the right sorts of things. So really pleased that we're launching this today. I'm just going to say a couple of things now about Construct Zero. So as I said, it's relatively new. We launched earlier this year as far as the CLC is concerned. And what we're trying to do with it is build the momentum and the platform that we've developed for the CLC through the COVID response, and now turn all of that effort, if you like, to actually targeting a reduction in carbon across the built environment. So we've got 3 strands of activity. We have the first one, which is all about performance measurement and all about being able, if you like, to aggregate up what the sector is doing in a measurable way and play that back to government and play that back to the public at large and say, look, we know what we need to do and we are doing enough of that. Within that, there's obviously actions that need to be taken for businesses, for projects and for the sector as a whole. So we're looking to outline those. And this is really where we start to pick up the detail of the code, because you've got a lot of detail in there around actually what you should be thinking about and what you should be signing up to, and how you really start to bring this to life. So in our performance framework, we will be doing things like monitoring the number of organisations signed up to the code as an indicator of how fast the sector is moving. So that's one of the links there. I said we've got an awful lot going on as well around supporting businesses and comms, which again, I think when you start to get organisations signing up to the code, using it, you're creating that little community where they can learn from each other. So that's the link as I see it. You know, obviously going forward, this is quite a fast moving space with net zero and what we need to do, and the targets as far as the government's concerned keep changing. So, you know, we're going to continue to work closely with the code as it evolves, as more organisations start to pick it up and sign up to it. But just to say, you know, from a CLC's point of view, really pleased to be supporting this, and look forward to working with yourselves and hopefully many adopters of the code going forward. So thank you very much for the time, Jennifer. Brilliant.
Thank you very much, Hannah. So the next thing that's going to happen is I'm going to give a very brief introduction to the code. So I'll share my screen. And someone will let me know, I'm sure, if they can't see my slides. This is, as I say, going to be very brief because of the amount we want to get through today. But if you would like more information, then please do go to the CSIC website, where there's an entire page dedicated to the code. So the carbon reduction code for the built environment is very important because we urgently need to tackle carbon emissions. We have a UK government target of net zero by 2050, and in fact a Scottish government target of net zero by 2045. But it's becoming increasingly clear that a linear reduction towards 2050 it will not be sufficient to keep us below 1.5 degrees centigrade of warming. Because carbon dioxide persists in the atmosphere, every tonne that we emit today will be up there for the next 100 to 200 years warming the planet. So we urgently need to save as much carbon as possible, as early as possible, and to do what we can with existing technologies right now, whilst we are tackling the future technologies that we might wish to develop. We cannot wait for future technologies to come along. So on that basis, what we really need to do in our industry, the construction, infrastructure and built environment industry, is to think about what we need to build, how we should build it, and with what materials and approaches. So can we get away without building something? Can we refurbish something we already have? If we do have to build something, can we build less of it by reutilising the assets that we have around us? If we are going to build as well, how do we build clever? How do we use materials that have a lower capital carbon, or ideally a zero or negative capital carbon? And then finally, we must build efficiently. So we must use less material and reduce waste, and do all of that while having in mind the whole life operational carbon as well. So if we're investing carbon now, it must be reducing our operational carbon over the long term. Having said that, that's quite a demand, I know, but there's plenty we can do. And one of the steps towards achieving that is this new carbon reduction code for the built environment. It's intended to facilitate action by relevant parties, so that's anybody on this call and everybody else in the involved with built environment assets, towards reducing carbon emissions in a collaborative way. It is absolutely not intended to replace PAS 2080 or any of the other standards that are out there. In fact, it references them. But it's very much a framework for organisations to make a public commitment to achieving net zero and to report on progress towards it. Not only for our own good, but so that as an industry, we can start to see how fast we're moving, and if we realise we're not moving fast enough, to work out how we can move faster together. Importantly, it aligns with the government's recent procurement policy note about carbon reduction in procurement. So if you are aligned with the code, then you're almost certainly aligned with that, and you'll hear a little bit more from Fergus later on perhaps about that. And finally, it has three key parts. There are 2 core commitments for all organisations to sign up to. And then there's a set of commitments for client organisations in terms of how they procure services and assets and how they work with their supply chains. And then likewise, a set of commitments for supply chain organisations, which I will just briefly show you so that you've got a sense of what's in the code if you haven't had a chance to look at it already. So the core commitments for all organisations are to aim to reduce direct and indirect carbon emissions by 75% by 2030. We really have to do that if we're going to have any hope of keeping to 1.5 degrees of emissions. And to meet zero carbon by 2045. The reason we specified 2045 in the code, as I've said before, is that that is the Scottish Government target, which is more stringent than the UK Government target. The other thing that all organisations signing up to this commit to is to set out plans to meet net zero by 2045 or earlier, and include annual targets, and then publish the plans and progress against the targets annually. And again, this isn't so much about sticks and beating each other with them. It's much more about working together to look at how fast we can move, learning from those who are able to move faster to bring the rest of us along on that journey. We've then got, as I said, a set of client commitments and a set of supply chain commitments. I won't go to those in detail, but just suffice it to say that there are core commitments and further commitments. So if you're signing up to the code, you're signing up to meet the core commitments, and the further commitments are there sort of to be good citizens, and we will publicise what people are doing in the further commitments when they're doing that. So what next for all of us? Well, the first thing is have a look at the code, read it. It's online now, and I think all of the attendees have been sent a copy. Your organisation can pledge to comply, or in the near future, will be able to submit a compliance form to apply to register for compliance. All organisations pledging or complying will be listed on the code website. And as Hannah said, we're all working together, and these things are moving quite fast. So as people sign up and start trying to use the code, no doubt there will be some further feedback on how we can improve it. So we imagine that the code will get up issued both as government regulations progress and as we get feedback from the community. So there may well be an issue 2 of the code in by the end of this year, for example. But the aim is to then have a formal launch aligned with the CLC presence at COP26. And that, I think, is everything I want to say on the code, because I would now like to stop showing my screen and pass over to James Wilcox, who is from the National Association of Construction Frameworks, which is one of the organisations that has been trialling the code in the run up to today and giving input to improve it. James, over to you.
Great, thank you, Jennifer. Good afternoon, everybody. Yes, I come from a background working for major contractors and specialising in sustainable design, particularly building energy and embodied carbon. But when I decided to take a short break, the NACF approached me to discuss this code trial and how to implement it best amongst their membership. Now, the best way of doing that was seen to be the use of a KPI, but you've probably already got a feeling from Jennifer's introductory presentation there that to capture a subject as big as carbon and as big as the carbon code in one KPI is much easier said than done. But the NACF itself only has about 10 KPIs to measure everything that it does. So there simply wasn't scope to be able to have a number of measures put in place. So it left a number of challenges in designing this solution. The first one, then, most obviously, is how would we maximize those opportunities to reduce carbon emissions in the built environment, but how would we continue to have something that was applicable to all the NACF frameworks, all of the contractors that are on those frameworks and their supply chains? So we started with some contractor engagement sessions that was really carried out to assess the different skills, capabilities, and test some ideas. And that led us towards drafting up the first version of the KPI. Now, it does target all carbon scopes because it would be wrong to ignore the larger scope 3 carbon, but we've broken it into a couple of different parts, where part 1 mirrors those core commitments that Jennifer has just shown you from the code. We haven't put any dates into those. They are there in the code for those organizations that don't already have them, but the engagement showed us that a number of them already did. So it was essentially saying, tell us what your plans are, tell us how you are performing against the baseline, and we will measure your progress against yourself, basically. So that caters to that diverse mix of contractors, different levels, different sizes, different capabilities. And it also enables us to account for some membership that is purely regional and others that are national. So what we've done is we've asked for contractors to submit net zero plans for a framework delivery area. The second thing we've done is to measure absolute emissions. Jennifer has touched on this, but if we are to achieve net zero, then we need to find a way to achieve growth without increasing carbon consumption. So if we measure absolute carbon independent of, say, intensity versus turnover, that's going to give us a good indication of whether we are traveling in the right direction or not. And we've structured some scoring behind the KPI that recognizes progress against these stated targets, but it is the sort of the minority element, if you like. The second part has that increased focus on the remaining scope 3, so anything that might encompass supply chain, embodied asset, operational carbon. And here we want to harness that effort and innovation. This is where the collaboration and the knowledge sharing comes in, because we needed to pull together with a collective effort on this issue. So we've given scope for larger, more resource-rich organizations to really flex their muscles, but we haven't precluded anybody who might be limited perhaps by the resource that they command due to the size of the company. Throughout the whole thing, sharing of best practice is recognized. And then the other key challenge here, and Jennifer has touched on this in her intro, is how do you get it to work in tandem with anything that's already established? So the NACF membership is very diverse. There are a lot of frameworks in there, and a lot of those frameworks already have plans focusing on different aspects of carbon. So again, we've engaged with those regional groups, discussed ideas and implementation around the KPI. And the KPI is not intended, like the code, to replace any existing or planned local initiatives, or indeed to exclude any specific focus areas. Instead, it's aiming to pull everything together and establish that large, powerful collection of data and best practice, as noted in one of the code outcomes. And again, this is where that absolute emissions as a base metric helps us. This, we hope, will satisfy the local government stakeholders from NASF that practical action is being taken to deliver on the climate emergency. So that's a very brief overview. Thank you very much. I will hand over now to Kat Ibbotson from the Environment Agency.
Thank you, James. So I'm going to give you an overview in terms of how I've approached the Carbon Code to the Environment Agency and what we're doing. And what I will say is we are already quite established in this area. So a lot of the commitments within the code we're already meeting. We already have work in train, or actually within targets, we're already looking to exceed those. So just to give you an overview, obviously the Environment Agency has its emission 2030 strategy, and within that we have our net zero commitments by net zero by 2030, the ambition for that. And also we have a net zero carbon program for infrastructure, which covers our scope 3. So in terms of the code and what we're looking at, we are already established in certain areas, and what we are able to demonstrate in the case study that we put forward is actually there are synergies all the way through, and it can very quickly become business as usual. And what I want to try and emphasize that the code isn't yet another thing that we have to report on. It's something that we build into business as usual and good practice. So what we're able to demonstrate within the Environment Agency is we already have outcome focused specifications within our frameworks. We already require our supply chain to provide carbon calculated through our ERIC returns. We have our tools and systems in place in terms of ERIC and CCT. So we already have a flow of information that's coming through. And what we're looking at is how we can also answer the request in terms of actually signing up to the code without it being an additional burden. And what I can say is it won't be, because we're already set up to be able to transparently provide our evidence. We're already looking at how we align to PAS 2080 further. And those two things do work in synergy, and they're not a replacement for each other. But what this also gives is another opportunity to ask our supply chain to support it in a more proactive way as well. So it's not just the client, it's our supply chain and how we actually move that down the different tiers. What I would also like to highlight is the fact that when it comes to being able to share that knowledge, that for me is a big part of this code, because we're all starting at different levels, and it's important that we share how we go about our carbon management, which methodologies we're using, what data, and actually sharing the good case studies as they come about, because there's a huge hurdle to overcome, and we are all on the same journey. So it's really good to see that the code has a big part in terms of knowledge share. And I know that's not explicitly covered within PAS 2018, and it does really support that in terms of that going forward. So for the agency, we already share our tools with our entries shared with over 350 external organisations. We share our case studies and fact sheets. We share with other client organisations through the infrastructure client group. So there's a lot of that going on. So we're quite comfortable in terms of being able to align to this code. We have a lot of things in place. What we need to do is like everybody, always be more consistent in terms of our approach, be more consistent in terms of making sure that every single one of our projects are doing what we want them to do, implementing the carbon reduction hierarchy, being really transparent within their business cases. And that's why within the net zero carbon program for infrastructure, we are looking at research and development in terms of carbon balancing. We're looking at actually how we look at our roadmap to net zero, how we put that plan together in terms of aligning investment alongside our costs, but also making sure that we're transparent in terms of cost and carbon throughout our whole decision making through that business case stage. So in terms of our organisation, what I can say, we're in a good position to be able to say actually there's a lot of things in there that do align to the code, and I think it also provides an example that a large organisation can also do this. But a lot of it is actually good common sense, good practice, aligning to good standards that are already out there. So it's really important that in terms of picking this up and be able to embed it and use it in a proactive way, is that it's built into business as usual. So what I'd recommend is obviously there's quite a detailed case study that we've put together to support the code along with the blog, and that really does outline an awful lot of what the agency is doing in terms of their overall programme. But it also gives you an insight in terms of how things can come into practice rather than just be a theoretical ask. So I think that's will be important for other people to learn from as well. So that's all I've got to say on that. So I'll pass back over to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thanks, Kat, and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Chris Hayes. I'm a Sustainability Operations Director at SKANSKA and part of the SKANSKA Costain-Strabag joint venture that are delivering the London Tunnel section S1 and S2 of the High Speed 2 scheme. Phase 1 of High Speed 2 will see the new High Speed railway line constructed from Euston to the north of Birmingham, and it will consist of about 140 miles of dedicated track, 4 brand new stations, and 2 new depots will also be built. Within our contract with High Speed 2, they set the S1 and S2 joint venture to achieve a 50% carbon emissions reduction target against an agreed baseline that we started way back in the tendering phases of that project. And in working to achieve this target, HS2 and the SKANSKA Costain-Strabag joint venture have worked with the partners on this code to develop the carbon reduction code as one of the tools that would help in the delivery of a lower carbon scheme. So for the trial, our trial of the code involved assessing the requirements and wording against our existing methodologies, what we had in place in terms of our procurement programs and processes, and how we were going to deliver operationally a low carbon construction program. And we undertook a gap analysis of what we had in place and what's in the code to take the opportunity to see if there were other opportunities to improve what we already had in place, what we're deploying. We did that both with the SKANSKA Costain-Strabag joint venture team and with the HS2 carbon team from a client and a contractor perspective of the sections of the code. Although HS2 and SES JV encountered no specific challenges in the trial of the code, there were some areas where tweaks might be made or could be made. As you can imagine, HS2 and SES JV are already quite progressive partners. We already have strong targets in place individually as organisations and as a client, and we already have quite progressive carbon reduction plans in place that were aligned around this agenda. So I already mentioned the 50% target already in place from HS2 to the joint venture. The parent companies have quite detailed carbon reduction plans to our carbon reduction commitments that align with or go beyond the 2045 of the code. And encompass full scope 1 and 2 and supply chain emissions, scope 3 emissions. So again, there's already a good deal of alignment there. And we're already past 2080 certified. So I see that as a much more detailed version of the code. In essence, the code kind of breaks that down into something more manageable and understandable. We've employed carbon and cost analysis to help drive down at that 50% target, incorporating those into digital environments, 5D plus BIM. A lot of innovation on the scheme around decarbonisation of plant using battery-powered plant and equipment, hydrogen-powered satellite compounds when we haven't got good electricity, and the use of composite materials, basalt and cement replacements, and all of the things you would expect in an efficient and carbon reduction focused construction project. So we're starting from a really, really good base. And in the trial of the code, there are areas of specific detailed wording and alignment which have been reviewed that maybe lend themselves to an organisational commitment as opposed to a large project or scheme. So taking my SKANSKA hat off and putting the S1, S2, SCSJV scheme hat on, the wording was more aligned to that of an organisation. A good example of that were the annual reductions, where you may see in an organisation the ability to set annual reduction targets and progressively decarbonise your business on an annualised basis. But with major construction and infrastructure programmes, the trajectory differs somewhat. You may start off with very, very low carbon, and then as we start to build up the construction phases, obviously the carbon intensity increases as the revenue increases as well, and then towards the end it will tail off. So there was discussions then around how we might tweak the wording in the code to reflect those different approaches that might need to be taken between major schemes and joint ventures and organisations. As with everything, early engagement was key, and starting schemes in this way with a full organisational alignment will deliver the low carbon outcomes that the code's trying to get to. That was one thing that we felt from our trial. The code helped to keep things simple, including measurement and quantification reporting. This is really critical in terms of demystifying carbon and open up the carbon agenda more, making it accessible through the full value chain, without the need to employ specialists or additional resources with a carbon specialism. You know, it's about being efficient, it's about measuring and improving. It's carbon is the currency rather than the science around carbon reduction. And in that respect, it is very, very much aligned with PAS 2080, but it kind of sets it out in a much more simple, high level way with clear responsibilities at different organisational stages and levels within the value chain, as the PAS does, but in a more high level way. Overall, we found that the purpose and intent of the carbon reduction code are absolutely aligned with the HS2 and the SKANSKA Costain Strabag joint venture scheme, and would work well in any large scheme more generally, as well as at an organisation level, with virtually all of the requirements already ongoing within our project. So that's our review. The full detail is up on the website. Please do have a look and contact us if you need any more information on that. And with that, I think I'm handing over to Peter Yates.
Thanks, Jennifer. Thanks, Dee Dee. And thanks, Chris. The National Association of Construction Frameworks, then, we represent local government frameworks across the whole of England and Wales. Between us, NACF members deliver approximately 7 billion of public sector buildings, civils, highways and infrastructure works per annum. We're members of the Local Government Association, and together with the LGA, Cabinet Office and BEIS colleagues, we actively partner with industry to promote best practice and help shape the future of public sector procurement. Regionally, our priorities do vary according to local geography and demand. However, we share the same key objectives to build quality and affordable assets and ensure we deliver to the social, economic and environmental needs of our local communities. So back in early 2020, we conducted a maturity assessment across our members to understand the issues faced by local authorities, many of whom have declared climate emergencies at a strategic and a political level, some with carbon reduction targets, but most still struggling to translate this into actual practical and tangible action, particularly at the grassroots delivery level. So this spurred us on to explore what the NACF could do to better support public sector clients to achieve their net zero obligations. So in late 2020, we set up a specialist NACF carbon group, and through contacts in BEIS and Construction Leadership Council, we approached Cambridge and joined their Achieving Net Zero group. Colleagues on this group immediately recognised the reach and value of our local government network, whilst at the same time warmed to the challenge of supporting us with a very much contrasting, much smaller scale of projects that we typically deliver, albeit in a very significant volume. And we agreed as a group that to make the code really work, it had to apply equally to all projects and major multinationals. We believe the Carbon Reduction Code provides a scalable method to enable industry and clients to understand and measure their journey to net zero. To facilitate the code within our frameworks, as James has already mentioned, we've worked in parallel to develop a new NACF key performance indicator, and we're in the process of trialling this across all of our contractors, across all of our frameworks. And importantly, we intend to cascade this throughout their supply chain to ensure maximum reach and impact in respect of carbon reduction. Early feedback on the KPI has been very positive, and we intend to report back on progress of working towards the code in the coming months. And with that, I'd like to hand over to my colleague Charmaine Hughes, Head of Frameworks at North West Construction Hub, owned by Manchester City Council, to say a bit about their experience as an NACF regional framework partner, leading on the development and rollout of the KPI and code. Thanks.
Thank you, Peter. Hello everyone. So the North West Construction Hub was established around 11 years ago in response to central government's drive to secure best value in public sector construction procurement. As a public sector framework, the hub works closely with internal Manchester City clients, Manchester City Council clients, and also external public sector clients across the North West. As Peter said, public sector frameworks have got a unique USP compared to other frameworks. We understand the drivers and challenges faced by public bodies. Carbon, lack of funding, political challenges, we experience them ourselves. As the construction arm of the council, it's imperative that in order to achieve Manchester's net zero 2038 ambitions, because Manchester's always ahead, sorry, had to get that in there, we understand the carbon impact of our contractor partners and our construction sites. The opportunity to collaborate with CSIC and NASF on the Carbon Code trial has just been incredibly valuable to us. CSIC's Carbon Code and the KPI and scoring metrics we've delivered to support its delivery will enable us to understand, capture and measure the impact of our contractors' absolute emissions. We've worked with our contractor groups and board members to review and test the KPIs, ensuring they're applicable to all sizes of contractors and all are supportive. We've developed a call to action for our contractors, asking them to sign up to the code and why. We're asking them to confirm that they have a net zero plan, to provide details of their absolute carbon emissions for the North West, details of the reduction targets. We'll capture those baselines in July, then provide an interim update to the NACF in December as part of their annual KPI process. Importantly, as James said, we'll be asking larger contractors to mentor smaller ones, and we'll be monitoring and sharing details of innovative approaches. Our approach to our clients is a direct one, providing an overview of our shared ambitions and benefit to clients. We're developing a brochure which will be shared at a later date. We're focusing on all hub projects across the North West to help clients to benefit on our journey on this trial. Thank you for your time. I'd like to hand over to Fergus Harridans from the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Fergus Harridans, Deputy Director at the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, and I'm here to provide a central government perspective on the carbon reduction code. So decarbonisation is one of the defining societal challenges of the 2020s, and that in effect makes it a public policy priority. Now, we are fully aware that there is an imperative to take action this decade, and government has set out a clear plan based on the Climate Change Committee's proposed trajectory for reducing carbon emissions of getting to a 68% reduction on greenhouse gas emissions compared to the 1990 baseline by 2030 as a stepping stone towards achieving a 78% reduction by 2035 and ultimately net zero carbon by 2050. Now, the built environment accounts for about 40% of all emissions in the UK. And as the built environment is a complex system of systems, action is required across all of the activities, whether it's design, it's construction, it's the planning side of it, or it's how we actually operate the buildings and infrastructure that collectively make up the built environment and also their interactions with the natural world. So we need both a policy framework and a set of processes, techniques and interventions that can both require and facilitate this coordination of activities so that we are approaching this in a truly systemic way. So in terms of the policy framework, which is key to setting the broad parameters within which we're all going to work, I think we've made a number of important steps really over the course of the last 6 months. So recently, government worked with industry to produce a vision for the built environment, which set out a new, almost a philosophy of how the built natural environment should interact, and established the principle that interventions in the built environment should aim to enhance the natural environment, and investment in one should not be seen as a trade-off in relation to the other. And this is very much a philosophy that is going to animate the forthcoming Transforming Infrastructure Performance 2 document, which the IPA will be producing, which sets out a roadmap for government investment in infrastructure in the built environment between now and 2030. In relation to the procurement of projects by government, over the last few months, we've seen the publication of the Social Value Framework, which emphasises the importance of as well as delivering a project efficiently, effectively, delivering it in such a way and producing a built asset that can contribute to the objective of net zero carbon, but also other environmental objectives, such as minimising waste and promoting and enhancing biodiversity. To supplement that, we've produced a National Procurement Policy Statement and PPN 0621, which are both going to require suppliers into major government projects to significantly improve their own carbon performance. It's going to create a powerful incentive for firms and other organisations to do that. We're going to be requiring them to report on their own carbon emissions across scope 1 and 2, but also scope 3 or indirect emissions, which marks a step change from what we've previously required. This will be across all of the 6 gases that were identified in the Kyoto Protocol as contributing to climate change. And we're also going to be requiring firms to report on the detail of the specific measures that they've introduced themselves and down their supply chain and what the impact of these is going to be. Now, we are also working with a wide range of partners in industry and across academia to develop a set of initiatives to support these objectives, because we recognise that simply setting a policy framework is not going to be sufficient. We need the mechanisms, the tools and the techniques for people to use if they're going to make a reality of the shift to net zero carbon. So over the last few years, we've invested in a number of initiatives. There's been the Transforming Construction Challenge, which is a combined government and industry £420 million investment programme in R&D projects, demonstrators and academic research projects. And I would say that at least 50% of those projects will in one way or another contribute to reduced carbon emissions, whether it's through improving design, minimising waste or improving the efficiency of construction operations. We've also developed the Value Toolkit as a means of helping procurers define what constitutes best value and take account of things like the value of reducing carbon emissions and waste in defining the design and the specification they wish to procure against. We've worked with industry to develop the construction playbook, which talks about the need for output-based specifications, longer-term contracting, more sustainable and collaborative relationships, and the importance of the industry contributing to these strategic policy objectives like the delivery of net zero carbon. So the code is consistent with the policy framework and the legislative objectives that we've set, in that it provides a framework for collaboration across the value chain, and it does place a great deal of emphasis on the importance of a systems-based approach, as well as collaboration amongst all of those involved in the management and investment in the built environment, between clients and asset owners, the people who manage assets, and the designers, the architects and the supply chain that develop and then ultimately deliver the projects that add to the built environment. So we see this as an important part of the framework of solutions going forwards, and it's an opportunity for us to continue to work with partners in local government and in the private sector in order to deliver these objectives. And I'm delighted to have had the opportunity to be involved in its development and now in the implementation phase. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Fergus, and thank you to all our contributors this afternoon. Hopefully that has given you all a sense of kind of how we've got to where we are and some of the opportunities that we think that this unlocks and some of the challenges perhaps that we face. If I could ask all of the panel members to turn their cameras on so that the audience can see you. And I will now endeavour to wrangle some of the excellent questions that we're getting in from our audience today. The first one is a fairly quick answer, so I'll answer that myself. We had a question from Athena about whether the code reduction targets align with the 6 carbon budget for the UK and the science-based targets. The answer to that is yes. And obviously, I said at the beginning that we will update the code if and when those things change, because obviously as we learn more about the pace of climate change and so forth, the science-based targets themselves will change. There was an interesting question from Paul Fiddler, which again, I'll have a first stab at, but I might pass over to perhaps Fergus for it. And the question is, do all organisations have to agree to 75% reduction by 2030, even if it's a hard to abate sector? So I think my initial answer to this is, we'd all think that we're hard to abate sectors, but we have to try anyway. And in the code, we specifically said we will aim to reduce because we recognise that this is difficult. but we also need to look at how we do it. And if we see that there are issues, we need to flag those. So if we don't plan to hit 75% by 2030, we certainly won't. And that's as a sector as well as individual organisations. But I wondered, Fergus, whether you had any thoughts on hard to abate sectors.
No, I think you're right. I mean, it's unrealistic to expect every sector and every subsector to be able to move forwards at the same pace. We have to recognise that there's some very profound technological challenges that are faced by particularly energy intensive industries in terms of the need to develop completely new processes for the production of materials like steel and cement. However, I think the basic principle is that we want to see everybody taking action, and taking action to the greatest possible extent that they can to a reasonable time frame. So it's not going to be good enough for people to say, we're in a hard to abate sector, it's all terribly difficult, please sir, can we be excused? Because the answer is going to be no. But what we do want to have, I think, is a sensible conversation with people in those sectors and with people in related sectors about how we can move forward collectively and what the most sensible trajectory is for everybody. Because we are going to have to manage this very much as a complex project with large numbers of organisations and individuals and initiatives involved. And collaboration and communication are going to be the key to making that a success.
Thank you very much, Fergus. We've had another question about the question I wanted us to put to Bays, but I'm actually going to ask Charmaine to respond in the first instance. So what, if any, support will be available for SME contractors and supply chain organisations to invest in the skills and tools to support the code? Because a lot of the sort of automation of production and delivery, for example, are specialist activities, and SMEs will need support to implement this. The reason I want to turn to Charmaine is that I know, Charmaine, you work with a lot of smaller organisations, and I wondered if you could respond a little bit about how you as a client would aim to support SMEs in your supply chain.
No problem, happy to respond. Firstly, in typical Zoom fashion, I do have to apologise because my next door neighbours have now turned on some kind of drill and there's a horrendous noise going on, so I do apologise. From the North West Construction Hub's perspective, as I said, we work with a very large range of contractors, from the ISGs of this world to very small local contractors on our low value frameworks. And I think one of the things that we recognised with James and Peter very, very early days was about the importance of having that education and mentoring. So one of the things that we've built into all the conversations that we've had with our contractor partners and board has been the importance to have a mentoring relationship. Because there are contractors who are well ahead, some of the ones that James, Peter and I have spoken to, they've got their achieving net zero plans already. They've already set themselves a reduction target. They've got their plans, and there are others who are just going, oh my goodness, what do I do with this? So what, as part of our launch strategy across the Northwest, what we're saying to the larger organisations is, we're looking at you to step up to the plate, to put your hands up and say, we are here and we will help you. And then we're going to act as almost a dating service to connect people. With some of these smaller organisations, in all honesty, they're probably not going to want to put their hands up because they may be thinking, they're a little bit embarrassed about it. But then that's the role of the hub and my staff to work with them and understand where people are having a problem, because we want to help everyone, because we're all in this together.
Brilliant, thanks, Charmaine. And the reason I wanted to ask Charmaine is because part of the code that's focused on the clients is, and also the sort of the large tier ones, for example, on the supply chain side, is that we need to help each other. And we recognise that there are some particularly small organisations who don't have the capacity to invest in this themselves. They don't have the manpower, for starters. So it's a very good question, and thank you, Charmaine, for that response. Fergus, just a quick one to you. Are there any plans at the moment from government to add additional support to this that you're aware of, or is that something that's sort of still in the thinking about?
No, we're certainly working with the construction industry through the Construction Leadership Council and our Construction Skills Delivery Group, which involves Bays, DFE, the Construction Industry Training Board and various other stakeholders, to look at what skills the industry needs for the future and what forms of well, it's both the training qualifications frameworks and the financial support need to be made available in order to stimulate that investment to equip the workforce with the skills that it's going to need in the future.
Brilliant, thanks, Fergus. We've got a question here from Alistair Mant, which is a very pertinent question, I think. It says, it feels that it's infrastructure and public sector focused, but is the plan that the code and commitment is taken up by clients and contractors who focus more on buildings, including private sector projects? As many of the contractors will be working across this anyway, it's a corporate commitment, not a project level commitment. So the short answer to that is yes. The second part of the question though is, either way, how does it fit with all the work that's already going on in the industry, including on commitments and collaboration around, for example, CLC's own performance framework, the Race to Zero, World Green Building Council, and so on and so forth? Kat, do you want to respond on how it fits? I could make an attempt, but I think it's more interesting to hear from other people.
I think one of the things
that's Stuart on the CLC piece, if I may. Sorry, Kat.
Yeah, no worries. I think one of the things that we're trying to make sure is that we have synergies across all of these different initiatives, and that is a huge challenge. Let's not diminish that, because there is so many things going on. There's lots of different pledges, there's lots of different action plans, lots of different standards. But one of the things that we're trying to look at is have a code which would, even though it may seem infrastructure focused, it is applicable to lots of different industries, including the built environment, and I think that needs to be recognised, just like PAS 280. The revision to that is also, it's not just for infrastructure, it's being looked at from a built environment perspective as well. So it's trying to create that umbrella across all of them, rather than it just be in isolation. Let's look at all these things from that individual perspective. But it does take effort in terms of everybody trying to work together. So I think what's important is if we can look at those specific sectors and say, actually, let's see how you would implement it. What are the challenges for your organisation? Are there things in there in terms of the wording which is not inclusive enough for the built environment that we may need to revise and improve as we go through? But we need to, push that forward to make it happen, rather than saying it's not for us.
Thanks, Kat. And Alistair, the other thing I would say as well is that we've got 3 case studies up at the moment, because obviously we've just been trialling the code so far. But one of the things we're very keen to do is, as more organisations sign up to the code or attempt to sign up to the code, to capture other case studies which cover different kinds of project. In selecting the ones we did, the NACF was obviously more focused on buildings, admittedly public sector buildings. Environment Agency is sort of long-term assets, and then the SCS joint venture was more about a major project. So we were trying to cover a range of scales and applications. But I think it is important that we try and pull those lessons learned together and provide case studies, and also provide more guidance. At the moment, there is some guidance on the website, but again, we want to enrich that. And also, I'm going to come to Stuart now, because the CLC work is also signposting a lot of things that would help to meet the code. So Stuart, do you want to just comment briefly on how the code fits with the wider CLC initiatives around net zero?
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer. So really, the CLC's main program at present is being worked through Construct Zero. We've also got some work undergoing through the Green Construction Board, but predominantly through the Construct Zero, which most units may be aware of, framed around really 9 priorities. Just close to consultations, so really we'll be looking the role of the code, and the role of carbon is quite prominent through a number of the 9 priorities through the action plan. So what we're looking to do really is to to work with partners, work with you on the call, and those who've responded to the consultation, to look at how we develop carbon, how the design is developed, how we maximise that, improve that, make it more efficient in terms of building efficiency and design in the future. So it's going to be quite a key part of the the Construct Zero project moving forward.
Thank you very much, Stuart. And I think again, we need to, as the 9 commitments areas that the CLC is looking at mature, we will again review those against the code in a bit more detail, and look to make sure that we're capturing everything that we should be capturing in the code.
Yep.
I'm just looking for some more questions here. There are lots. I'm just sort of doing a quick filter. How can clients and Tier 1 organisations support their supply chains to adopt the code? And I'm going to turn to Chris Hayes for that, if I may.
Thank you, Jennifer. How can we support the supply chain? So an awful lot of this, as I said in the trial, is around demystifying carbon. And I think that the supply chain probably have the biggest part to play in this in terms of technology and intelligence and green solutions that the tier 1 contractors and clients are looking for. And I think what the role of the contractor, the tier 1 contractor, is to facilitate and enable those green solutions to come forward. Part of that is going to be in training and awareness. Part of that is going to be in incentivization and how we ask for things and how we promote lower carbon solutions coming through. And another big part of it is on simplifying how we measure and report things and try and have a common carbon currency rather than lots of different methodologies and tools and calculators across the industry, just to make it easier for the supply chain or the SMEs or the smaller organizations that aren't necessarily resourced as well as we are, for example, to fully contribute to this.
Thanks, Chris. There's been a couple of questions around Scope 3, which is an important question to answer. So the two questions that we've had are, will there be standard guidance from government about the treatment of materials under Scope 3? Because as an SME contractor, it's unclear if they're under our Scope 3 or those of the client, but either way we need to provide data. But who's going to take the hit for owning the Scope 3 emissions? And then a separate point that's related is Scope 3 can account for 80 to 90% of an organisation's overall carbon footprint. And by having a target in the code that says Scope 3 where appropriate might not encourage a joined up approach to Scope 3 reduction plans. So Fergus, I wonder if I could ask you first about what the government's view is towards Scope 3 and how we start to capture that, because as I understand it at the moment, we're largely focused on Scopes 1 and 2 in the sort of formal reporting process.
Yeah, so the previous reporting requirements have focused very much on Scope 1 and Scope 2, but I think the point that's made in the Q&A is exactly right. We've always known that Scope 3 is really the bulk of the iceberg in terms of organisational carbon emissions linked to the undertaking of business activities. It's not just a construction issue, it applies across the economy. So in recognition of that, we've set out a new approach through PPN 0621, and it's something that we are going to expect firms to start tackling now. Now, I recognise that this is a new departure and we haven't got guidance. We're not quite certain as to how this is going to work. But what we want people to do, I think, is start trying to do this now and reporting on it. And by virtue of that process, I think there's going to be a more rapid process of learning because we're going to be learning by doing. So the policy and the principles behind it, I think, are pretty clear. But I do take the point that in future, we're probably going to need to do a lot of work to understand how we can best do this and embed this kind of reporting throughout what are long and complex supply chains in this industry.
Brilliant, thank you, Fergus. And I think we've got time for one more question. And Peter, if it's okay, I'm going to put it to you because I think you've been very involved in this. But there's a question as to how the code fits with the construction playbook and how that's sort of rolling out. So I wonder if you could share any views you have on that.
Yes, thanks, Jennifer. And I suppose not just myself within the NASF, but a number of parties working with Fergus and the team, those who developed construction playbook, have been testing a number of the tools associated with that, not least the value toolkit. And I think from, if you like to mop up several of the questions that are being asked, I think we recognise the ability to, I suppose, affect the greatest influence is at that early decision-making process. And if you like, I suppose the issue we have in public sector is because of things like public contract regs, we are very often divorced from ultimate decision-making around products and materials somewhere down a supply chain, particularly when you've got very large scales of projects. But we've learned through a host of things, not least the work we've been involved in around building safety recently, but also a piece of work we've been doing looking at ethical sourcing and modern slavery, that we need to, as clients, stand up and understand where our materials are coming from. And very much, I think, ingrained in that is an understanding where the carbon comes from. So the ability to be informed at that kind of initial briefing stage around certain key decisions around where materials might come from, I think is fundamental to how we will corporately achieve our targets within local government, local authorities. And as I mentioned in my piece, the majority of local authorities have signed up to climate emergency. How they actually deliver that on a project level or even on a program level, they haven't got a clue. And this, I think, the code directs them. And as I say, we will interface because necessarily we need to. And I think many of colleagues on the call will find their way of interfacing and implementing this code. But for us, it means that we necessarily will have to engage and open up that dialogue with the supply chain. A piece of work that we're doing is through the LGA and working with a number of academic quality colleagues, is working with the Supply Chain Sustainability School, specifically around ethical sourcing. And again, in that is the kind of the whole carbon piece. And decisions and questions asked around, well, you could choose product A or product B, the carbon source, the energy used to dig this product out of the ground is a coal-fired, a power station somewhere 6,000 miles away that's got to then be transported here, or actually you could buy it locally. The physical product might cost more, but actually the embodied carbon might be significantly less. In answer to our colleague from the SME who's asking, should it be lumped on them? I don't think it should be lumped on the individual, but I think it's incumbent on the individual to raise that to the client and sort of say, here is your choice. And then they will answer to their corporate, cabinet member hires and betters to say why they chose said product with a higher or lower embodied carbon. And I think that's where we can look to sort of best practice through the playbook. It is encouraging local government, central government and industry to work collectively together to really tackle this. I don't think we can push it. For far too long as clients, we've sat there and just sort of pushed it down the tube and sort of said, not our problem, we're not experts in this, we'll get the contractors to sort it out. That's not fair. We've actually got to work together to make this happen.
Brilliant, thanks very much, Peter. There have been a load of fantastic questions in the box, and as ever, we've run out of time to answer them. So what I'm going to do as I draw this to a close is to say that we will certainly capture all the questions and we will endeavour to incorporate them into either an FAQ if they seem like general questions, or perhaps we'll be able to put a sort of Q&A session up once the video for this event has gone online. So we will endeavour to provide some kind of response via the website to as many of the questions as possible. Thank you so much to our attendees for coming and for engaging so proactively with the event. And thank you hugely to our panellists who are not only here today, but have also put an awful lot of effort into trialling the code. And many thanks also to the many people who gave input as we were developing the code. There were people from all kinds of organisations who took the time to review it and give us feedback. So that's been really helpful. Our next steps are basically next steps for you really are to go to our website where you will find the case studies that were mentioned during the presentations, some information on how to pledge to commit to the code and how to comply with the code. And as I said, we'll add the additional questions with some answers to the website. And we'll also invite additional comments and questions via an email address on that. So I think with that, it's for me to thank everybody very much for your time and to close the event. Thanks all.